In this video, we're going to be talking all about the principles of ecology. It's a lot of information, so make sure you're keeping up on your notes organizer. Pause the video whenever you need to. So ecology is the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. There are two kinds of factors that we look at. Biotic factors, which are living factors in an ecosystem, for example, bacteria, animals, plants, protists, and fungi. And abiotic factors, which are non-living factors in an environment, for example, water, sunlight, temperature, rocks, and soil. So you can look at this picture and see a lot of different abiotic or biotic factors. For example, we see the water here, abiotic factor. The birds, on the other hand, are a biotic factor. And you can go through this picture and pick out different ones. So the biosphere is a portion of the Earth which contains life. It extends several kilometers above the Earth's surface and several kilometers below the Earth's surface. So what makes up a biosphere? Organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and biospheres. And those are the ecological levels of organization. But what do each of those terms mean? Let's talk about it. The smallest level of ecological organization is the individual organism, one organism. As an example, one individual rattlesnake. That is an organism. Now, a population consists of a group of organisms of the same species which share the same geographic location, so a single species. An example, a group of rattlesnakes living in the Sonoran Desert together. A biological community consists of the interacting populations which occupy the same geographic location as in all the organisms in that location. So for example, rattlesnakes, lizards, coyotes, fungi, cacti, and grasses of the Sonoran Desert would be a community. An ecosystem consists of all the biological community and all the abiotic factors that affect it. So now we're starting to add those abiotic factors in. So an example, the rattlesnakes, lizards, coyotes, fungi, cacti, grasses, and the sunlight, sand, rocks, temperature of the Sonoran Desert. So we added those biotic factors we saw in the community with abiotic factors in order to create an ecosystem. A biome, which you've already done some coloring on, is a large group of ecosystems with similar climates, plants, and animals. So an example, the Sonoran, along with all the other North American desert ecosystems, make up the desert biome. And last but not least, the largest is the biosphere, which is all of those biomes, and then extending a few kilometers above and below the Earth's surface. So the biosphere is everything. And you can see a picture here if you're more of a visual learner. We have our individual moose. We have our population of moose. We have the community that the moose lives in, including some other animals in the environment. We have that ecosystem, biome, and then the biosphere. So we've already done a lot of coloring and worksheets on biomes. If any of the information I'm about to discuss on the next couple of slides you don't have written down, get out those biome sheets and make sure your information is correct. So what we use to classify biomes are precipitation, temperature, plants, and animals. The major terrestrial biomes, as in on the land, are desert, grassland, which you'll sometimes see those broken up into temperate grassland and savanna, but for our purposes we're going to call them grassland, shrubland, chaparral, temperate deciduous forest, coniferous forest, which is sometimes called the taiga or arboreal forest, and the tropical rainforest. And our aquatic biomes are freshwater, such as lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams, transitional, like wetlands and estuaries, think kind of swamps, and then marine, which are the oceans. And over here, you can see that of the aquatic biomes, a majority of them fall under the ocean spectrum, being that saltwater. And then within our freshwater, most of it is held up in glaciers. So very little of the planet is freshwater biome. Here's a biome summary chart. You had your own biome summary chart to fill out, so if you need to pause this video and check some of your information, please do so. Some graphs that you need to be familiar with so you can read them. On this one particularly, for example, if I told you that the average temperature was 10 degrees and the average precipitation was 100 centimeters, you can go from the 10 degrees where it meets the 100 centimeters and you see that that is a temperate forest. These graphs down here, students have a little bit more trouble reading because they have graphed temperature and precipitation on the same graph. The line up here is showing your precipitation over here, and then down here you have your temperature. So you can kind of see how reading those two at the same time can be confusing. Kind of a look at a freshwater biome for you. And a look at a marine biome. Coral reefs are a very important marine biome. They are, and you can see kind of the beginnings in here. They're so important because they get a lot of sunlight, and that warm water allows a lot of interesting animals to live there where they can't live in anywhere else in the world. So a habitat is an area of an ecosystem where an organism lives. So it's more specific than a biome, and it's more specific than an ecosystem. It's a specific area. And a niche is the role or position that an organism has in its environment. So it's the job it does. For example, our honeybee over here, his niche is collecting that pollen. Now he does it accidentally. He's trying to just get nectar from plants, but that doesn't change that his job is to collect that pollen. Without him, the ecosystem would fail. So if you remember, a community is a group of interacting populations. In other words, all the biotic organisms in an area. Now these organisms cannot just grow indefinitely. There is something called limiting factors, and that is any abiotic or biotic factor in an ecosystem that restricts the size of a population. Some examples are water, sunlight, food, shelter, space, predators, prey. All of that can cause your population to change. Every ecosystem has a carrying capacity, and a carrying capacity is the maximum number of a population an ecosystem can hold. And on a graph, you can see when a carrying capacity has been reached because the graph kind of levels out and will just kind of go up and down around this line. So you see our changes in deer population. It started out really low. They did a lot of reproduction, and then that population started going back down, and from then it's just kind of flirted with the 80 size from there forward, and that tells us that 80 is our carrying capacity for this given ecosystem. There are two categories of limiting factors: density independent factors and density dependent factors, and their name makes sense. Density independent, meaning that the density of that these factors are independent of the density of the population. So a factor which does not depend on the size of the population. Just like if you say that you're independent, it means you do not rely on your parents. So kind of think of it that way. Examples: weather events, fires, air pollution. None of that has anything to do with how many individuals are living in that area. A tornado is going to come whether 10 people are living there or 10,000 people are living there. It's independent of the density of the population. Now, density dependent factors do depend on the size of the population. Just like how on taxes your parents can claim you as a dependent because you depend on them. Examples: disease, competitions, predators, parasites. So you know what happens at Lassiter? If one person gets sick, it seems like a ton of students then get sick. It's because disease spreads faster when there is a higher density. Competition: the more individuals there are, the more significant competition is over food resources, for example. Predators: if you have a lot of prey, you're also going to have a lot of predators because there's lots of food for them to eat. Similarly, if you have very little of that prey species, predators are going to start dying off because there's not enough for them to eat. Kind of the same logic with parasites. So how does a biological community form? Ecological succession is the process through which one biological community replaces the other, and it results of changing biotic and abiotic factors. And there are two types of ecological succession: primary succession and secondary succession. So primary succession, just like the name implies, is kind of the first thing that would happen. Takes place on exposed bare rock which lacks topsoil. So we are just talking about rock here, nothing else. Usually follows a volcanic eruption or a retreated or melted glacier, so nothing is there anymore. It's going to begin with a pioneer species like lichens, mosses, and liverworts. You'll then start to get small kind of herbs and grasses. After that, shrubs will start to grow in those grasses, and then eventually you'll get trees. Secondary succession takes place in a newly cleared area, but topsoil is still there. So it's empty, but you still have soil. Usually follows something like a forest fire, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. It's cleared out any of the big things. So this does not require a pioneer species because that topsoil is already there. So you can see you start to get some plants very early on, still getting those shrubs, then pine trees, and then your bigger trees from there. So competition. One or more organisms attempt to utilize the same resources. Competition does not equal fight. You don't want to think about it that way. They're not fighting for things. For example, all of these robins are in competition with each other for worms to feed their young. If they don't get enough worms, their young will not survive. They're not fighting for those worms, though. They're just trying to get as many of them as they can. Predation is when one organism captures or kills another. Hunter, predator, hunted, prey. So in continuing our bird-worm scenario, the bird would be the predator and the worm is the prey. However, not all relationships work out that way. So the term symbiosis is a long-term close relationship that exists between two or more species. There are three types of symbiotic relationship. There is mutualism, and you can think about mutualism as two smiley faces because everybody is happy in this arrangement. Both individuals get something out of it. Commensalism, which is kind of like a smiley face and then a face that doesn't care, because one individual is getting something out of it that makes them happy, but it's not bothering the other one, so they're not hurt or helped by the interaction. It just happens. And then last is parasitism. In parasitism, the parasite is happy because it's getting something. However, the individual that is on is unhappy because it is losing something. It's actually hurting it. For example, ticks are parasites. When you get a tick, it's sucking your blood, so that doesn't make you happy, but the tick is happy because it's getting food. So that's parasitism. Just to make sure you can see those definitions written out, mutualism, both species benefit from the relationship. An example of this is oxpeckers eat pests off zebras. So the zebras get fleas, ticks, all kinds of other bugs on them. The oxpeckers land on their back and eat those bugs off. The zebra is happy because its parasites are gone. The oxpecker is happy because it got a meal. Both of them have benefited. Commensalism, when one species benefits and the other is neither hurt nor helped by the relationship. For example, birds nesting in a tree. The birds are happy because they have a safe place to live. but it doesn't bother the tree in any way. The tree isn't being helped by the birds, but it's not being hurt by them either. Parasitism, one species benefits while the other is harmed. Ticks living on dogs is a great example. That's why you give your dog flea and tick medicine. The tick is a parasite, the dog is a host, and so that relationship is parasitism. So in an ecosystem, we also need to look at how energy is transferred. And you've heard these terms before. So autotrophs, also known as producers, organisms which use energy from the sun or substances in order to produce food for the organism. They can do this by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So these are your plants and your mushrooms. Heterotrophs, also known as consumers, are organisms that obtain energy by consuming other organisms. Whether that's plants or animals, they still have to eat in order to get energy. Now within those consumers, we can break people down into can break them down into different categories. Herbivores only consume plants. Carnivores consume only animals. Omnivores consume both plants and animals. Detrivores or scavengers, you'll see the terms interchangeably, consume the remains of plants and animals, so once they've died, think about like vultures. And then decomposers break down decaying matter externally and absorb the nutrients internally, so like fungus. This brings us to food webs and food chains. They model the flow of energy through an ecosystem, and each step is known as a trophic level. Now over here, we have a food chain. It is a food chain because, like links in a chain, there's only one thing connecting to another. And we have our trophic levels. The first level is the producers. So over here, we have our grass. Second level is going to be herbivores, often called primary consumers, because they're going to feed on the grass. Now we have our omnivores or carnivores. They're going to be that secondary consumer where they're going to consume the primary consumer. And then as we get farther up, we will only have carnivores, and they're going to feed on the levels below them. Now once again, this is a food chain because it is only showing one pathway. However, over here we have a food web, and this is a model representing the many interconnected food chains and pathways in which energy flows through the organism within an ecosystem and biological community. It illustrates all the feeding relationships, all of them. So unlike a food chain that's just picking one path, this is showing all of them. But food webs are made up of simple food chains. So you can find food chains within a food web. For example, I can go from my plant down here to these insects, to these rats, to a snake, to the hawk. That is a food chain within this food web. But the food web includes multiple producers, multiple primary consumers, multiple secondary consumers, and you can see where they are all interconnected to each other. Where yes, the insects eat the grass, but then the insects can be eaten by rats or frogs. But those frogs also eat small fish. So it is not just a simple laid out path, you're showing that interconnectedness. And in a food web, once we get all of these organisms, when they die, are going to be decomposed by our decomposers. So they all link back to the decomposers in the end. And you can see that our arrows are showing where the energy is going. We have our energy from our grass going to the insects, which is why the arrow is going upwards. Once again, a food chain is a simple model which demonstrates a linear flow through an ecosystem where we're just going from one to the other, from plant to grasshopper to mouse to snake, nothing else entering in there. Unfortunately, energy is lost at each trophic level. 90% of the energy is lost, meaning only 10% of the energy is retained. So if your producers had 100 as their energy, the primary consumers are only going to get 10. So that makes things difficult. Producers have the most available energy from the sun, So they have the largest biomass and the largest population. At each level, as you can see, because the triangle gets smaller, our population gets smaller as our energy gets lower. So our top carnivore, those tertiary consumers, have the least energy available because each time they only got 10% of the previous group. So they have the smallest population. Energy pyramids illustrate this energy loss very nicely, like you can see here. Showing you just another energy pyramid with actual pictures, where if we started with 1,000 kilocalories of energy in our grass, since only 10% moves up, that means we will only have 100 kilocalories available for our gophers here, and our wolves will only have 10 kilocalories per gopher that they eat. So they have to eat a lot of gophers in order to eat enough energy, just like the gophers had to eat a lot of grass. So it causes us to have very few of our top level consumers because there's not enough energy to support them. Those are our video notes. If you missed anything, go back and watch this video again.